Would it be fair to say that the sanctions that Congress passed and were implemented into law were critical in bringing Iran to the negotiating table?
Yes.
Yes, but along with the global nature of the sanctions, the EU sanctions, that was the critical determinant, not just the U.S. sanctions, the others.
But the sanctions that we passed, in essence, got the other countries to join because they had secondary consequences to them. Isn't that not a fair statement?
Absolutely, Senator Menendez. I mean, I remember the debate over SWIFT and central bank sanctions and oil export sanctions that you co-authored. The Europeans were opposed to them, and because of congressional pressure, they eventually went along because they were under U.S. secondary pressure.
And isn't it fair to say that the threat of sanctions, even though suspended during performance, but the threat of sanctions is a significant deterrent towards breach in the future?
I would say it depends. If we're alone in threatening those sanctions, you know, they'll be partially effective, perhaps, a partial impact. But what makes the greatest difference is when you have the other global economies, Japan, China, Russia, the EU on board. That's when the Iranians finally decided to negotiate. We couldn't bring them to the negotiating table in 2006
So if
and
oil
2007
is more important to you
with
than
US
Iran
sanctions.
achieving a nuclear weapon, our deterrence is all gone, is basically what you're telling me.
That's not what I'm saying.
Mr. Dubowitz, is the continuing threat of potential sanctions, including the sanctions that are implemented in law by the United States, which has secondary consequences? I mean, it seems to me you have to make a decision. Do I want to do business with a maybe trillion-dollar economy, or do I want to do business with a $17 trillion economy? And in that respect, while I may grudgingly not like it, the reality is I want to do business with a $17 trillion economy.
Senator Menendez, we don't sanction countries, as you know. We sanction companies and financial institutions, and our sanctions are powerful. The financial sanctions are powerful because they're based on market participants making risk-reward decisions, tens of thousands of those decisions every month. And the notion that financial institutions are going to go rushing back into Iran on a congressional vote of approval or disapproval, I think actually defies the history of what's exactly happened. We don't sanction Japan. We sanction financial institutions in Japan who will be cut off from the U.S. financial system under U.S. secondary pressure from Sasada.
Isn't it fair to say that if snapback is to mean anything, it has to be snapback to something? Because otherwise, what are you snapping back to? If that is heralded by the administration in the testimony brought before this committee, that we can do everything that we are doing now if they violate. If snapback is also considered a deterrent, isn't it mean you have to snap back to something?
I would say this, Senator, and I understand the question. The purpose of the sanctions is tactical, is to influence the behavior of the government of Iran. If the negotiations were to break down, or if the Congress were to disapprove, I would favor American sanctions reimposed on Iran. But I wouldn't believe that those sanctions would drive Iran back to a deal because we wouldn't have the buy-in of the rest of the world.
So then snapback is insignificant in what you're saying?
No, I think snapback is critical.
Can't have it both ways, Ambassador. Right. Either it's significant or it's insignificant. Which one is it?
No, I'm answering your question. Snapback
let me give a simple question. Is it or is it not significant?
Snapback
is significant or not?
Snapback is important, but it's only going to be effective if we have some major economies with us.
Okay. And Senator Menendez, the problem is it's going to be snapping back in 10 years against an Iranian economy that will be twice the size, with hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, where a number of the contracts, and there's been a dispute over this, but some of the stage of the contract will be grandfathered. There'll be huge business lobbies in these capitals, and so we'll be snapping back against a much harder target in 10 years than we'll be snapping back in a year or two.
That presumes performance over this whole period of time.
Correct.
Right, so that snapback could actually take place sooner if, in fact, there is a violation of performance, except that in a letter that the Iranians sent to the Security Council, dated July 20th of this year, it says in paragraph 6, and I quote, "It is clearly spelt out in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that both the European Union and the United States will refrain from reintroducing or reimposing the sanctions and restrictive measures lifted under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It is understood that reintroduction or reimposition, including through extension of the sanctions and restrictive measures will constitute significant non-performance, which would relieve Iran from its commitments in part or in whole. So basically, what I try to get from Secretary Lew, and I can't get from my own government, I have to read it from the government of Iran to understand what the agreement, as I read it, was about, and the language is pretty clear, that the sanctions that expire next year, that the Congress passed 99-0, at least in the Senate, and overwhelmingly in the House, that was signed by the administration, that the administration, notwithstanding what you say, Ambassador Burns, heralds as the reasons that Iran came to the table, with tough diplomacy as part of it as well, and will expire next year. Well, number one is you're not going to be snapping back to that. And number two, the Iranians are saying if you just simply reauthorize it as it is, with all of the waiver options the president has, they will consider that a violation. So we, the Congress of the United States, have been told basically by the Iranians that our actions, in essence, will violate their understanding. Now, I don't know what you snap back to if at the end of the day you don't have anything in place in law, notwithstanding whether or not you get the international community support. And then it goes on, now I understand why Secretary Lew didn't give me answers to my questions, because there's a further sentence in here. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action requires an effective end to all discriminatory compliance measures and procedures, as well as public statements inconsistent with the intent of the agreement. So that's why Secretary Lew wouldn't give me a definitive answer, because number one, they signed an agreement that says Congress can't even extend the existing sanctions with all of the present waivers. And number two is if you say something wrong, that's also in violation. That's pretty outrageous. Pretty outrageous.
Well, and the Iranians are right, Senator Menendez, because, I mean, if you look at paragraphs 26, 29, and 37 of this agreement, I mean, they've effectively written into this agreement a nuclear snapback. Now, the administration will tell you that there is a distinction between nuclear and non-nuclear sanctions. The Iranians don't believe there's a distinction between nuclear and non-nuclear sanctions. They believe that any reimposition of sanctions will constitute a breach of this agreement, and they will essentially use that, in my view, to threaten the Europeans not to join us on any transatlantic snapback. And if Nick is right, and the Europeans are essential to a snapback, then we will lose some of the Europeans, if not all of them, when the Iranians begin to threaten nuclear escalation when they walk away from this agreement based on 3 provisions in the agreement they believe justifies that.
Mr. Chairman, I have several other lines of questioning, but I will hopefully wait for a second round.